work looking at the public transport experience as behavioural scientists, so looking at how people think and feel and behave. And we came to the conclusion that there's a brighter future that lies in adapting our transport system to our more human wants and needs. So yes, we need engineering to make things go, and it's essential to get people from A to B, but we need to think about this sort of messier reality of how people think and use transport. So I want to start with possibly the least controversial statement. We're all human, and it's really good to start with a very agreeable starting point, quite elementary in many ways. The people we're dealing with are human, and people are not cargo, which means they have an active participation, an active role in choosing how they will or they won't travel. And when they do travel, they're more than passive objects. There's things that they might do with their time, and there are things that are meaningful and worthwhile on a trip. Now, the trouble is, we don't always think of people as human. We start thinking of people as labels or names like customer, driver, passenger, wheelchair user, cyclists. And all these things are slightly dehumanizing. They're understandable labels, but they take us away from the people aspect. There's good hope when we look at transport design, because we know that we design engineering systems for our physical bodies. Like, we readily accept the steering wheel uses our opposable thumbs to grip, but we're not yet quite as good at designing to accommodate for our brain's evolved characteristics, which is why there are lots of pain points that we experience on a daily basis, like signage or ticketing or instructions or safety aspects, for which we're using that are designed for the brain's transport planners wish that we had, but we don't really have. So I want to start by saying, in a way, we do have elements of a Stone Age brain, but we're living in a much more high-speed world. So with that in mind, we really want to make sure transport systems now and in the future adapt to what we actually do and think, rather than what we wish we were like. There's a good way to illustrate this, and it's with this checkerboard illusion. So I pose a very simple question. Which square is a lighter shade of grey? Is it the A square or the B square? I suspect if we had a poll, we'd get a lot more B squares looking lighter than A squares. But in actual fact, they are precisely the same shade of grey. It's a common trait of psychologists or behavioral scientists to demonstrate visual illusions. But I want to say that they're not merely quirks or hacks of how we think. They are actually revealing some quite important truths in how we perceive the world around us. The reason that they look the same offer these two effects noted. One, the color constancy effect. So this green cylinder is casting a shadow, and your brain is used to seeing shadow, so it upweights things that are in the shadow space. The other is an opposing luminescence. So it's a checkerboard. We've seen many checkerboards, and the clever way this visual is put together is the grey just changes shade just a little bit. Now, I've given two theoretical reasons and evidence-based reasons for why they are the same shade of grey. But I know, having presented this several times to people, I know that you're saying, but Pete, the thing is, they're a different shade of grey. I can see it with my own eyes. Seeing is believing. The B square is lighter than the A square. And I think this is a useful lesson as to why we all use the context around us to perceive the world. That context is learned over many years and is inherent within us. Sometimes just evidence alone isn't enough, and you need to take away the context or look at something in a different way in order to achieve some agreement. So I think as I get rid of the green cylinder, we might see some more convergence, maybe even more so now. And now I would say it's very likely you would all agree that the A square is the same shade of grey as the B square. One of the peculiar things is when we bring all the context back in, it all switches around again. And you'll probably see the B square lighter than the A square. Now, the leap I want to make, and I think is useful to apply theory and evidence of how we think, is to say there are useful lessons here in transport planning and transport experience. So fundamentally, we need to understand what other people's contexts are. We need to understand what other people's grey squares and checkerboards are, and their own history of seeing, in this case, green cylinders. Because sometimes when we're talking across purposes, we're not meeting people where they're at. And the phrase meeting people where they're at describes this technique of acknowledging beliefs and value systems, partly because they serve our own purposes, but we've learned them over many years, and they're important in the culture and community that we're in. These three examples pictured are, I would say, examples that we should take heed of, that are transport policies that are important, but they're not necessarily intuitive. Some transport policies are counterintuitive, and these counterintuitive policies need some extra special attention. They need special attention, they need to be communicated transparently and clearly and with quite a lot of care. And that's because many complex policies are well known to the person communicating the policy. They've had years with it, they've sat with it, maybe like us in the room, they've read articles and journals, and they've seen the evidence as to why these would be successful initiatives. But when it comes into contact with reality, and the first time someone hears about it might be just months or weeks before its implementation, and they haven't sat with it for quite as long. And their understanding of it doesn't necessarily hinge on the fact there's evidence to support these things that might seem slightly non or illogical. One example would be on the right-hand side there, the smart motorways. It's slightly counterintuitive to think that slowing a motorway down could improve journey times, that taking away a hard shoulder that was ostensibly put there for safety reasons could improve safety outcomes. Likewise, it might seem perplexing that for a scheme called a low traffic neighbourhood, you are lowering traffic by reducing the amount of road space and roads around for cars. And these are important ways in which we should understand that we need to communicate the evidence, but we can also do a really good job by bringing that to life to people and doing innovative things in ways that people would understand better. And there's that phrase on screen. The trouble is that people don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't always do what they say. This is at the heart of it, that people think with their minds and their brains and their bodies. And the important thing is that we use a mix of evidence. So whenever you speak to a behavioral scientist, they're very likely to talk about the importance of data on, in this case, travel data on how people behave, but also the importance of speaking to people and understanding them through different forms of research, qualitative research, where you gain more insight into people's lives and where they're coming from. It's useful to think about the way in which we're going to move forward into a newer world, a vision for a new and different system. I think I really want to emphasize the importance that the things that we're going to do in the coming 10, 20, or even 50 years are going to need to be evidence-based, but purely relying on evidence when something new needs to be done will always lead you to be looking back rather than forwards. So some initiatives do need to be evidence generative. And there are some neat examples of things that have been effective. So on the left-hand side is an electric vehicle that has a little green flash on the number plate. That was introduced a couple of years ago and is unique actually to the UK in signposting to people which cars are electrically driven. The UK is actually now gaining pace more than almost any other nation in EV adoption, and this small little green flash is a helpful note to seeing more EVs in your neighbourhood. It has other operational benefits of being able to identify which cars are electric, and helps people maybe gain some pride and status in the more sustainable choice that they've been able to make. There are some other ones like these live departure boards, which I think are a really useful story in understanding why, when we make the case for public transport improvements, we definitely need to make it more punctual, more reliable, more affordable to travel by public transport. But if we only use quite a harsh numerical model to think about people's journeys, then we'd miss these neat innovations that can actually make a trip a lot easier, less stressful, and simpler to do. So these display boards are used, but live bus departure boards are used commonly in the UK on the right, but the Netherlands has come up with some more lo-fi solutions of this little solar-powered one, which gives some basic information on bus stops that don't otherwise have such substantial infrastructure. And these are important because the nature of a waiting time is not merely its duration, but also its perception. A study about 10 years ago found that having these display boards reduced perceived waits by about 2 minutes, and having that information up front so people might plan their journeys and know, for instance, that they would arrive at the bus stop, in this case for this bus to Worthing, also allowed them to reduce the amount of time they wait because they could plan around it. So these display boards really help our perception as well as the reality of the things that we're moving. And as a behavioral scientist, it's really important that we generate information and evidence on what works. So on the right hand, in the bottom right hand corner, we have a bus, and this is a bus from Brighton, where that bus operator found that replacing the advertising hoardings on the outside of the bus with the route that the bus was travelling on substantially increased bus ridership, and particularly from people with access to a car. And that's the theory goes that's because people don't find the bus as salient when only the destination is printed on the front. Usually the destination is some kind of bus depot rather than some much more salient or important destination. And they also get to see this information right at the point where it's attractive to them, as the bus might be whizzing by in its own priority bus lane. So operators are finding these interventions. Where we need to move towards is some evidence to really show, right, should we put these on all of our buses or some of our buses? What's it worth to us? How much advertising revenue are we happy to forego in order to gain certain trips? In the bottom left-hand corner, we have, of course, the new clean air zone. And I want to emphasize the importance and the great opportunity there is right now in sharing the progress along the way. So as much as we might introduce a clean air zone, we may have evidence from other places, but the way in which communications is a really ongoing challenge, and public engagement happens not just before a scheme starts, but also in the weeks that follow, in showing, yes, there's this progress, or we're seeing these improvements in clean air, or the real gains are coming in 6 months, or what have you. So this is a sort of an active, I would say, this is whole thing is an active process to generate work. I have 2 more points to make before I wrap up. The first is now actually to zoom out a little bit further and ask a slightly more fundamental question about where transport fits in. And that's because transport can get quite bogged down in assuming that there are trips to be made and people to be ferried about, what's called derived demand. Other things generate the need to travel, and us people working in the transport sector simply need to service those journeys and get people to where they want to be ASAP. Some of that is true and definitely useful. We also need to see the way in which what transport does is fundamentally sort of give people access to seeing other people, getting employment, getting goods and services, getting opportunities. It does have a unique selling point, and I'll get to that, but primarily trips are enabling some access to some things. But there's other ways in which people might achieve similar ends. They might do, in this what's called spatial proximity, or jargonistic word for staying local. If people had the services nearby, then they would need to travel almost not at all, a very short walk. And that's changes that we need to do by collaborating with land use. Increasingly, the choice to travel has other competition, or we might say complementary options of connecting digitally. Clearly something I'm doing right now, something many of us adapted to quite swiftly during the COVID pandemic, as that red circle was so restricted, the green circle got a lot bigger. And some of those digital connectivity things shift the nature. They might generate trips as we connect with people, or we can arrange things online before we do them in person. Some of them shift the nature of travel, say away from a personal shopping trip towards deliveries at home, which are put the emphasis a little bit on a different aspect of the transport infrastructure, so freight and couriers. As we look at this, what's called triple access model, which was published about 6 or 7 years ago now, and I know is used quite widely across local authorities and government, we should be mindful, as much as we collaborate, to make sure we bring just this one important, unique aspect of physical mobility of transport, that it does give people the chance to get out, to see places, and that having mobility is a sort of a right and a need, an ability to see new areas and meet new people. And that when we sit down, we should think about the extent to which this physical mobility should be enhanced, that more people being able to see more places has an important benefit, but perhaps in moderation. And that gets me to my last point, which is I see personally a much more optimistic future where we work towards more balanced diets of travel behaviours. So if you entertain the metaphor, we can think about people's travel habits a little bit like our food habits, and we'd readily accept that dining out on fast food, while convenient and actually quite an expensive option, is not a sustainable way to work, but also is a way that would restrict people's great variety and ways of getting about. Now, it's easy to assume that people are very monomodal in their travel, but the evidence suggests actually people traveling already have quite a varied diet, but it would benefit from being more varied. So consider the stats, this is at a UK level, that 83% of cyclists also have access to a car, and that people with access to a car actually covered 26% more mileage by train than people without access to a car. So some people actually have quite a big diet, and when they have a big diet, they travel in quite a lot of different ways. So a helpful way is to embrace the fact that people can and often want to travel in different ways. And that if we could rebalance some of these and shift some of these, we would get a lot further. When we do talk about people traveling in different ways, I've observed that there can be a shift, or there's two camps in talking sometimes about mode shift, which puts a lot of it on the individual to say, why can't they shift from this way to travel to this other way of travel, which is reasonable. And there's another approach that zooms out a bit further and looks more at systemic, in this case, car dependency. And I think both views are valid, but I think a behavioral scientist is a big school of thought in behavioral science, probably looks more at this systemic level of urban car dependency, both real and perceived. So people depend on cars because they have to, because they're the only options. But there are also some perceptual elements where the car is stacked in effectively a royal flush of biases, that it's right there when you need it, it waits for you, you don't wait for it. You can hop into it, you can see it from your bedroom or your kitchen window sometimes. And these other ways of traveling take a little bit more sometimes thought or planning or work around. So I'll close with something that I think is really important, and it's you can hopefully see it come through, that the future involves driving change in a co-driving method. So we need to sit together with people and work together. That means at a policy or a professional level, but it also means embracing the fact that people have different objectives here, and that's okay. I'll cite the co-author of the book Nudge, Cass Sunstein, who, before publishing the influential book Nudge about 15 or so years ago, coined the term incompletely theorized agreements. Unfortunately, jargonistic term for a really important point, which is the observation that most often progress arises when there's agreement on actions, where people don't necessarily always agree on exactly why we're doing it, but they want to do it all the same, which is to say, the possibility that congestion is a problem might be one person's need to get to their destination sooner. Someone else might be thinking about the importance of air quality. Someone else might be thinking about the health benefits of active travel. So what you think is a primary benefit might be someone else's co-benefit. And I think it would be a crying shame if we fought over why we're always doing these things rather than getting ahead and doing it. So we need to accept that no one person's issue is always going to be in the driving seat. There's lots at play here and there's lots to tackle. So we'll close there and welcome any questions. Thanks very much.
I'll think of a question right now. I haven't read your book, but I now have a copy and I'm not giving it back. So in terms of the things you've talked about here, you've talked about behaviour change, you've talked about the need for evidence, looking backwards and forwards. And one of the things that I find slightly frustrating is that government will fund infrastructure developments and then government will fund research, and there's a massive gap between the two. They don't come together. So quite often the infrastructure gets put in and we have local authorities doing everything from the installation to the bid writing, and then they don't have the resources to do effective research like, say, universities or other organisations do. So do you have good examples of where this has worked well?
Of where there's been an opportunity,
where there's been this true kind of relationship between evidence, research, and infrastructure developments, where we put things in, we collect the evidence, and we go, there you go, that worked, that didn't, let's stop doing it, or let's do more of this.
I think it is on us. I don't have I wish I did have a really clean line and succinct line to share with you. I definitely agree with you with this challenge of innovation and piloting things, and the challenge there is just to bid and get funding to pilot something, and then the permanent or the wide-scale installation of that thing. In defence of, for instance, I think maybe the e-scooter schemes are bordering on a decent example here, where they were put up as as specific areas to put them as a trial, and there were initially only a couple of areas identified for as trial areas, but that's moved out to be some 30+ authorities now, and those trials have been ongoing, reported on, and now extended. And I suspect we didn't think we were, in 2020 would be in this position in 2023 of having quite so many trials ongoing. But that was a way in which there was trying to generate evidence on an emerging transport technology. I would say it's definitely confusing from the individual person on the streets perspective that it's legal to rent a rideshare e-scooter, but not legal to buy one individually. And there are good logical reasons why that's the case, of insurance and coverage. But for the points raised previously, that it does feel rather counterintuitive, but it is working to generate evidence, and other countries have done it in a different way, of much more laissez-faire option of permitting private e-scooter ownership and not really monitoring or generating a lot of evidence along the way.
You gave a good answer. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Pete. It's Oliver Coppard. I'm the Mayor of South Yorkshire. I'm going to abuse my position to be able to ask you a question. You'll be familiar with the term information action fallacy and the idea that human beings aren't rational, as you already explained in your presentation. If we don't respond to rational information about why getting the bus or using public transport is a better alternative than using the car, what do we know about what does influence people's use of public transport, which might not be quite so rational? You've already used one example, which is the display boards, which shorten people's psychological waiting time. What else do we know that might be useful for us to take on board here in South Yorkshire?
Yeah, good question. And behavioral science is always really embedded in this question of sort of rationality and irrationality, or I think more people want to call it sort of non-rational pieces. I've sat in many lectures, read a lot about different concepts of rationality here. I think for transport professionals, one to take home is like everyone's rationality is somewhat individual. So this concept of logic, what is logical, doesn't always make sense in a transport situation. I think it can make a lot more sense in banking, of saying somebody's finance is irrational, because you can more obviously say, well, this investment is clearly better or worse than this other one. But when it comes to picking how to travel, how to commute, how to get your kids to school, whatnot, what is rational is what you would call like ecologically rational, like personally rational. I think it can make a lot of sense to some people to travel in certain ways. So when we think about things that are rational, we talk about people being biased in different ways. But do people have a comfort bias, or a really need to arrive on time bias, or a feel good for taking the sustainable option bias? It's really difficult. And I think, probably to answer your question more directly, a good way to think of it might be what's in it for me and what's in it for us. So the me and we connection. There's a lot of times you can actually engage people in thinking not merely what's in it for you, definitely very important. But when you think about people, when you get people out of their own bubble and start thinking about what's in it for, in this case, proximately like my household or my family or my friends or my local community, then you get people to take on this identity that's a little bit broader and bigger than themselves. Because there's definitely policies, perhaps for some people, the clean air zone included, there's not loads in it for them, but there is a big deal in it for people they're, say, related to or that they care about. So getting people to take that wider thinking process. And sometimes when we do research, it's important that, for instance, a consultation might be framed in terms of what's in it for you and asking how you think about it. But there's this other technique called deliberative research, which gets people to sit and think and hear and debate from different positions to take a slightly wider point of view. And I think that can elevate us above this station of just thinking about the me aspect all the time.
Thank you, Pete. That's really kind of you to come and present to us today. Does that answer your question, Oliver? Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I do have a couple of books spare, so come and talk to me.
Great. Thank you. Look forward to following up.
Thank
all
you.
the best for the day. Sorry.
Cheers. Bye.
Oh, well, hello, everyone. 3 incredibly inspiring talks and more good stuff to follow. We've been sitting for a long time, so if you want to stand up and just take a moment to stretch ahead of going to the next session, this is a good moment. We've got the opportunity to stand up, so you should have the same opportunity. Well, you certainly can, yes, out there, yeah. So hello, my name's Sam Markey. I am here from Connected Places Catapult. If you haven't come across us before, we are the UK's innovation accelerator for cities, transport and place leadership. I'm really delighted to be here facilitating and working with the team at South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority on this. I really commend the leadership that's being taken. A few examples of sorts of things that we do at the Catapult which might be of interest, might be relevant to give a flavour of why we're here. We've worked with cities in Brazil on their bus rapid transit system to try and work out why are more people not using this amazing bus infrastructure, and looked at how we could increase passengership there. We're currently doing some projects around transport safety for women and girls to encourage participation in public transport by those user groups. We've done some interesting work on agent-based modelling and how you convince a driverless vehicle it's in the real world when it's really in a digital model, and work out how to design and think about the impact on highway schemes and new flows and predict the impact of closures and changes. So really interesting uses of data. And we've worked with Belfast City Region on their City Region deal, which is all about connecting people across a diverse area to economic opportunities which aren't in their immediate patch. My role specifically is working with place leaders like yourselves to hopefully inspire, certainly encourage and resource you all to be confident, articulate customers of innovation, to understand the art of the possible, to be able to have confident conversations with your suppliers and with those out there who are coming forwards, to learn from others around the world who are doing pioneering, important things. Because as we've heard, actually, many of these conversations about place, where it might start with transport, but actually it ties into health, it ties into environment, it ties into well-being, skills, economic prosperity. And so it's a very integrated conversation. So I'm really, really pleased to be here. And I'm joined on the panel. You're going to hear mostly from me. I'm just here to kind of facilitate. And I'm joined by colleagues who'll be helping with this afternoon's workshop. But in this session, we're going to hear some practical examples, some lived experience from a number of places around the UK. So, very pleased to welcome Sajeeda Rose, who is Corporate Director for Growth and City Development at Nottingham. Councillor Donald Alexander, Cabinet Member for Transport at Bristol City Council, and hopefully online, if not now, then at some point, Daisy Narayan, who's Head of Placemaking and Mobility at Edinburgh. And of course, we've also got John Dowie, Executive Director for Infrastructure and Place for here in South Yorkshire, who will tackle any of the local questions that you might have that I can't answer. So I'm going to invite each of our contributors just to say a few words of introduction about themselves. And then I've got a set of questions I'm going to ask, but I hope you're also going to help me ask some questions and tease out some of the learning from their experience. How have they managed to achieve the schemes, the projects, the programs that they have in their areas, and what are the lessons, what are the transferable opportunities for us as we embark on this journey together? So Daisy, just want to say a few words of general introduction and why you're here?
So I think
Daisy's on the Daisy, I'm so sorry, yes, I beg your pardon.
But isn't. So
no, she is there now.
It's
Daisy. It's Ruth. Okay. Hello, Ruth, in lieu of Daisy.
Hello, yes. Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. And my colleague Daisy Narayan wasn't able to make it today. So you've got me, I'm afraid, but I'm really excited to talk to you all about our city mobility plan, which is our new local transport strategy for Edinburgh City Council. Talk to you about some examples that are within the plan, how we produced it, the kind of co-design and collaboration that we undertook to create the plan, and that it's got a slightly different focus to the standard kind of traditional transport strategies of old. So if it's okay, I do have some slides. Would that be all right to share on screen?
Yes, we have, yeah.
Okay, one moment, just to have a bit of life and visuals to my presentation.
We can see your slides, yeah.
Great, okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so as I said, the City of Edinburgh Council, as I know, a lot of areas have declared a climate emergency. That was in 2019. We've got an ambitious target as a city to get to net zero carbon by 2030, so quite an ambitious ask really, and really absolutely transport is absolutely critical to that, being the single largest producer of carbon emissions, both across Scotland and in Edinburgh as well. So we needed a really bold new plan focusing on delivering a sustainable, efficient, inclusive, safe transport system across the city. Our answer to that was our city mobility plan, which we had approved to council in February 2021. It covers the period up to 2030. And as I said before, it sort of sets itself slightly apart from traditional transport strategies, and it's not just focused on movement, but it's focused on people and how they actually experience, how we all experience moving around, no matter what our circumstance, ability, age, or whatever. It looks at affordability, it's connected to the Poverty Commission work that our council has been looking at, and really focused on how we can create better places for health and well-being as a result of prioritising more active and sustainable trips. So it ultimately does have climate emergency at the heart of it. I appreciate this slide's quite busy, but I wanted to just give you a flavour of where our city mobility plan fits within the sort of national Scottish context, and all the way down to the local sort of action delivery planning that we do. So at a local level, it shows how the plan will inform the delivery of various action plans, which I'll talk to you about a bit later, including other major schemes that we've got happening and implementing at the moment for our low emission zone, for our city centre transformation, alongside a lot of other things as well, very much connected with our planning service. I'm actually a town planner. I've no real expertise in transport as a sort of university qualification. I'm really coming at it more as from a placemaking perspective, so a bit of a different angle, I suppose, that I've tried to bring to that piece of work. So it reflects that parallel development with our city plan, which is our emerging local development plan, and making sure that what we're doing with our transport strategy is fully aligned with land use planning and sustainable development across the city, given that we've got so much growth happening across the city at the moment and into the future. So this slide's just a bit of a sweep through, I suppose, the main transport challenges that we have in Edinburgh that we've been seeking to try and address in as holistic approach as possible. So the first one, as you would expect, is climate, as I've mentioned before, the significant target we've got to reach for net carbon zero. We're the fastest growing city in Scotland, one of the fastest in the UK, so we need a really sustainable transport network to support that and to support economic prosperity into the future. In terms of congestion, we all know and get frustrated with that, and we have an issue, as many cities do, with dealing with congestion affecting the quality of our streets, efficiency of our public transport system and active travel infrastructure, making it feel safe, and the perception of safety. Congestion has a really big part to play in terms of us achieving reduction of that. In terms of poverty, we're seeking to tackle issues around that and ensuring that transport is fully accessible to everybody in the city, no matter what your circumstance. Health and wellbeing, as I mentioned before, really focusing in as well on air quality. So within our transport strategy, we've got air quality as one of the key actions, clean energy and air quality, connected with the low emission zone work that we've been doing and other action planning. Safety, we've got absolutely have to consider our vulnerable road users, pedestrians and cyclists, children and the elderly, more at risk of suffering serious injury if involved in collisions. So we really absolutely need to prioritise our resources on that. Inclusion, poor public transport accessibility in some peripheral areas in the city, and low car ownership leads to isolation, as we know. So we've tried to make this plan really consider that element in terms of its next steps. Equality as well, kind of linked really, in that we need to recognise everybody has different needs and abilities. So we've tried to weave that through every aspect of the plan, from really the grassroots engagement that we did at the start, right through to the product and the delivery and the continual monitoring that we've been doing. And then last but not least, placemaking, because as we know, streets are all too often heavily dominated by traffic, affects our quality of life and our well-being. So we need to create more livable places which prioritise people over cars. So just appreciate, I don't think I have a huge amount of time left. Really, in terms of the sort of main areas of the plan, we focus on people, place and movement. With the people chapter, that's the first chapter in the document. And it's really about reflecting the responsibility that we all have to be more mindful of the choices that we're making when we travel. It reflects as well the engagement, 3 years of engagement we've done with stakeholders to really set out what's needed in this plan and make sure it's a kind of co-design process. So everyone's bought into it, hopefully. We still have difficult conversations, as I imagine everybody across this room have in making change, and difficult trade-offs that we have to make to get what we need from a more sustainable transport network. It looks at affordability as well, and really our ask of citizens of the city to contribute their bit and make more healthy, sustainable choices. In terms of the movement, now this is probably the biggest chapter just because of the sheer volume of elements that we've covered in here around sustainable and integrated travel, safe and efficient movement, clean air and energy. It includes all our plans for expanding our mass rapid transit system, which includes the tram. We're looking at expanding north and south as well as east-west. A huge amount of work going into looking at mobility hubs and how that can help interchange and create better transition from your sort of doorstep through to your destination in as most sustainable way as possible. So we've got some pilots we're developing across the city at the moment, working with communities to do that. Walking and cycling networks, managing demand, absolutely critical, looking at how we can do that in as better way as possible without, you know, enough as many carrots as we get sticks, I suppose, in terms of managing demand, so that we can get proper buy-in to different ways in which we can manage traffic, which is helpful to people and not restrictive in the sense of excluding people who really absolutely have to use certain modes of travel. And then in terms of place, the last but not least chapter in the plan is around placemaking and good street design. So we talk a bit about our 20-minute neighbourhood strategy, streets being for people, not cars. Our city centre transformation strategy was absolutely critical in this, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But moving on, just conscious of time, we've got an implementation plan for the city mobility plan, which makes it absolutely deliverable and realistic. So it's not all just visionary and objectives and things like that, but it's got targeted milestones and timelines for when we want to deliver, what we want to deliver, how we're funding it, where we've not got funding, how we intend to seek that funding, and who's responsible to deliver that. We've also got a commitment to review that every 2 years to make sure it's realistic and deliverable going forward, and we're reporting on that at the end of this year, about, you know, where we're at with things and how, moving on to kind of measuring success, how we're actually doing against our 15 key performance indicators to make sure we're absolutely doing what we need to be doing, and where we need to accelerate actions and meet our targets. You know, how do we reprioritise and how do we further that conversation and bring things in quicker? And we do have challenges with that, as you know, every council area will do, and working very closely with partners across the region and with Scottish Government is critical to that, to making sure that the processes and things that we're doing to accelerate change can be done in a way that is, you know, as beneficial as possible, supported by as much funding as we can get, with resources being as tight as we know they are. We've also got a target to reduce car kilometres across the city by 30% by 2030, which is an increased ambition on the Scottish Government target of 20%. So again, another ambitious target that we're really striving to meet, and trying to set that out in a tangible way to our residents, citizens, you know, in terms of that means every, if you've got 10 trips, every 3 of those trips, how can you make those more sustainable, and trying to make it tangible. So we've got a big conversation we're starting with the city in a few months' time that I'll touch on very quickly in a minute. 20-minute neighbourhood, this isn't teaching anyone anything new really, I don't think, because it's a concept which has been certainly embedded in planning and, you know, good neighbourhood planning and sustainable development concepts for a long time. But I think because of the pandemic, as we know, we've recognised that necessity around local living, and it's kind of changed our focus and shift. So we've got a huge amount of work going on in 20-minute neighbourhood, in the 20-minute neighbourhood programme, which I think is absolutely critical to achieving the targets that we have. City centre transformation, I'm not sure if anybody is aware of the work that's been done in Edinburgh on this, but this was a really big programme, and it is continued to be a really big programme, which was approved in 2019. And as you can see just there from the slide, it was created from examining how we could tackle some real issues with transport and vehicular dominance in the city streets, We held major public consultation asking what level of transformation people wanted to see, and over half of the people that we communicated with wanted to see absolute widespread radical change. So there was a real mandate for change here, and that engagement remains absolutely critical going forward. So things like trialling the Open Streets programme that we were doing just before COVID hit us, allowing people to see the benefit for themselves rather than just saying it will be better and not actually allowing people to see the benefits, and that was very successful. So another slide just there, I suppose, just to show you the extent of the city centre transformation plan, the ambition around a walkable city centre core, high quality streets and public spaces which allow an improvement, people to actually experience the beauty of the city as well rather than just move through it. Inclusive and accessible for people of all ages, looking at vertical connections as well as, making sure that the streets are clutter free, but also, given Edinburgh such a hilly place, how can we create a more accessible city, making use of infrastructure to create vertical connections as well, such as lifts connected with the station and that kind of thing. Look, we're also looking to review the bus and coach taxi strategy. Lots of work going on around freight and deliveries for the city centre as well, in terms of an operational plan to make the city work better for all different types of uses, not just people moving through and visitors. And then just a couple of finals. Yeah, sorry.
I'm just gonna pause you. We may well come back to you, but
Okay,
I want to give room for others to contribute. So thank you for stepping
apologies
in.
for
Some really,
talking too
I
long.
definitely want to come back to some how you've
Right.
achieved some of those things. But
Okay.
let me just pause you there for a moment.
That's fine. Yeah, no problem.
No problem at all. So, Councillor Alexander, Bristol, very well known as a cycling city, very ambitious with its transport network and its bus network in particular. Tell us a bit about the journey. How do you create the political momentum and the narrative to make some of the kind of changes and the investments which you've achieved in the city?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a big question. Bristol, I suppose, from the outside is famous for Banksy and as a relatively wealthy city. In fact, it has some areas of deprivation, particularly in the south of the city, for those of you who know it. But what Oliver said earlier about poor public transport being a driver of deprivation is absolutely correct. We have areas of the city where it would take you 1 hour on the bus to get to the centre, and those people often live their lives on that estate largely, and it is easier for them to get to South Wales in some cases, and where we have industry, it's easier for people in South Wales to get there and to get those jobs, good jobs often, rather than the local people. So it's quite a divided city. It's been very important as well for us to enter into a combined authority, the West of England Combined Authority, and it's good for me to be here today. Part of the reason I want to be here is actually to see another CA and to see how it's working. We have a long history in Bristol region of very, very challenging regional politics. Urban and rural is part of it. Political, well, we have Jacob Rees-Mogg just outside Dr. Liam Fox. So we have the whole spectrum politically within our combined authority, and that has not worked in the past, but now we have to make it work, because we simply have to make, the things that the outcomes that we all want cannot be achieved on the footprint of any of our one authorities, and we have to start with that point of recognition. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm here to be probed further.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And Sajeeda, likewise. So Nottingham has its tram network, and it's taken some pioneering steps around its transport planning over the years. Again, what's been the secret sauce in terms of being able to step out in those ambitious ways? How have you built momentum and got buy-in?
Thank you. And you're right. We've taken some bold, brave decisions, and I think a lot of it stems from having a long-term approach. It doesn't happen overnight. Having a long-term strategy, a long-term consistent approach. And I think in our case in Nottingham, long-term stable political leadership, we haven't had any change for as long as many of us will remember. And having that vision, sticking to that, having some visionary leadership at a time when it took, so for example, the tram, that was bold in its day. And I think there's a moment in time. I think the risks that we took at the time, introducing the workplace parking levy, controversial, but having that bold vision, that consistency, that commitment to public transport, and commitment and having that vision for integrating how transport works effectively across Nottingham. And you know, a number of colleagues have mentioned today, transport is an enabler. It's not it's not just about journeys, and it's not just about how people travel, but it's about how it connects up opportunities. And I think Nottingham, probably worth just reflecting a little in terms of the city. It's quite a tightly bound city. Congestion was a huge challenge for us prior to introducing the tram. So there was a burning platform there. We knew that 70% of that congestion was caused by commuter traffic. It was costing businesses over 200 million a year in terms of lost time. So there's a real burning platform there. But converting that in towards what we now have, an extensive tram network, extended twice, introducing the workplace parking levy, which was controversial, but that enabled us to develop the network in the way that it has. That generated over 100 million in the time that we've had that. But through that workplace parking levy, through the commitment towards an integrated long-term, a sustainable transport network, we've enabled additional improvements along the way. We've been successful in attracting significant funding. We always want more. And to the Mayor's point earlier, I think East Midlands is one of the lowest funded per head in terms of infrastructure. Nottingham's done well, but there's always more to be done. So currently, in terms of our plans, it's about building on that network. It's about how we utilise that network that we've already got, and that commitment towards sustainable but affordable transport. So we talk about deprivation. Nottingham's the 11th most deprived in the country. We've got a real challenge in terms of some of our communities and about how we provide access in those communities. We've got the lowest car use in many car ownership. Sorry, only 56% of our population own a car. So in a sense, that does create that momentum and that scale by having a tightly bounded city, huge challenges around congestion, but also then that demographic, in a sense, to support that public transport network. So I think for me, in summary, it's that long-term vision, consistent improvements, that continuous improvement, learning from how others do what they do well, building on that network. We were lucky at certain points, some of the decisions we took when we took them, there's a moment in time, having that resource to be able to do that, decisions around the workplace parking levy, all of those coming together and building on that in the future.
Fantastic. And perhaps a follow-up to both of you. We'll have some people in the room who represent major employers in the area, and you've touched on that particular issue. What works in terms of engaging and having a constructive conversation with large employers, with your anchor institutions, in order to build a common plan, a common strategy, recognising that each of us will have a part to play in that. I don't know whether either of you want to pick that up.
I'm happy to. In Bristol, we have a thing called a one city plan. So we have actually set up a governance model where we've got several boards. We've got a transport board, and we actually bring in I chair it, co-chair it, and every 3 months, 2 months, we have a meeting with a number of partners. We actually make set objectives as a city and as a transport board, and then we form like little task and finish groups where so we've got one on freight, for instance, at the moment, an area like that where we haven't got much of a handle as a local authority on it really. So I think for a local authority, it's about humility. It's about recognizing that we aren't where we were 100 years ago, able to pull all these levers that control the city. We actually don't have many levers left, but we do have the power to convene people. And we just honestly recognise that and say, this is how we're going to do it. Let's all get together. We've got City Hall. We do the chairing, we do the resourcing, and work together. And it's called One City, and we've got our own website for that, and you can have a look. I don't think there's nothing revolutionary about it, but at the root of it, I think it's just the recognition of where local authorities in this country truly are now.
Sajeeda, or indeed John, from this or your previous role, any views on how we engage effectively with our anchor partners and employers?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, you go.
And a couple of reflections. I currently work for a local authority. I work for Nottingham City Council, but prior to that, I was Chief Executive of the Local Enterprise Partnership. And the very essence of local enterprise partnerships is about how you bring together collaborative partnerships between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. And I think building on that model in terms of recognising that as local authorities, I absolutely agree with the councillor that we have to be humble. That we don't have all of the levers. There has to be a strong partnership within place between all of those partner institutions and stakeholders, and business are a key part of that. So within combination of working with the LEP in terms of understanding what the drivers and the needs are for business, and then integrating that from the public sector perspective to understand how we can sometimes get out of the way, but also in other occasions how we can enable growth and facilitate growth. And transport is often recognised as an infrastructure enabler for investment to grow. And in our case, we work with we have the likes of Boots and Experian, Capital One, some of the larger employers. We work very closely with them. And certainly when we established a workplace parking levy, we had to work very closely to demonstrate the benefit of what we were introducing, which was inevitably an additional charge for business. So that close collaboration, understanding the needs from a business perspective, but then realising where the local authority has a role to play in terms of that place stewardship and leadership, and recognising we all have our roles and having to work together in tighter economic circumstances where local government doesn't have the same resources as perhaps it may have done before. Enabling growth, facilitating that has to be that partnership and understanding respective needs and roles. So we try to, it's not no different. Every area has its own way of engaging, but recognising that the strength of that partnership and needing to work in partnership to realise the true potential for every local area is key to me.
Do you want to add anything?
So I guess I've spent a career, 20 years working in central government across England, Scotland. I then worked in a bus company for 6 years across the 2 countries plus Wales. So I've kind of seen lots of different places, how they've delivered, how sometimes they haven't delivered. And I think one message is you build a partnership for the long term. Sometimes partnerships are built in the good times, and then you've got to something to call upon when it's difficult. If you try and build a partnership just when you've got to do something difficult, it's probably too late. The trust isn't there.
Yeah, that's very useful. Ruth, I'm going to come back to you if you're still on the line. I'll stand here so you can actually see me and I can see you. Hello. So we touched earlier on the fact that often transport schemes and placemaking can be quite disruptive, and that Edinburgh has is renowned for being a really amazing built environment, urban realm, and you were touching on that as I paused you a moment ago. I wonder if perhaps you could tell us to what extent. So we talked about partnering with our employers and our local anchors, but obviously we have a large group of suppliers and business partners who are delivering these schemes and these projects. I'm sure you were setting your suppliers, setting a high threshold of quality and challenging them to innovate and think about how to reduce disruption and how to drive value in this scheme. Perhaps you could say a few words about how you're using that commissioning power that we have. You say local authorities don't have huge power in every way, but they do have that political leadership and they do have a large commissioning budget. Perhaps you could just say a few words about how you've used that spending power to stimulate innovation and these transformative schemes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's got to be based on a trust around the vision that you're wanting to achieve. So, I think with Edinburgh particularly is a good example of that. We've got our World Heritage Site and a lot of transformations happening in the city centre. We've got a whole host of different really tapped in partners and stakeholders, from heritage bodies through to community groups, who want to see and should expect a degree of quality and consistency across public realm measures and actions that we're taking. I think that we do have very difficult decisions to be made on what we can achieve within the realm of what is spendable, what funding is that's there. We are quite successful in getting a lot of match funding as a city as well through working with different partners and Scottish Government. So I think just developing those relationships and being absolutely clear about the ambition and the vision that we want to see, and having a strategic plan rather than piecemeal bits and pieces that aren't really joined together. And that I suppose again brings that thing back to the the vision that we have for the city and making sure that people are bought into that level of quality, because it adds value in terms of then, you know, the city benefiting from that, with people visiting and seeing what an amazing place it is, and us as custodians need to be absolutely clear and strong on our position on that as well. Fantastic, thank you. Anyone on the platform want to touch on that question? How you use your spending power to challenge our suppliers to deliver these schemes with the best possible performance, and using the new technologies to drive better journeys? Or not? No, that's fine. They're very good, very good. Look, I'm going to come to the floor in a minute, so either be putting your questions on, either put a hand up or put them on Slido. Have you got some already you would like to go to? Excellent. Well, let's start going to ones on the floor. I've got a few more if we dry up, but go for it.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Andrew Denniff from Barnsley and Rotherham Chamber of Commerce. Just picking up on the point earlier about engaging with employers and business, and given that this session is entitled "The Art of the Possible," it's a question, really, probably an open-ended question to our three, Bristol and Nottingham and online from Edinburgh, and then possibly maybe a comment from John at the end, but just the kind of view from the outside looking into our region. What do you think the challenges are for South Yorkshire that are maybe different to your part of the world, and what we might try to aspire to? And then, John, possibly maybe having heard those reactions, what will success look like for South Yorkshire by 2030, which seems to be a fairly common target year for a lot of people? So it's kind of an open question, really, around what is the art of the possible, but I'd be interested to get the kind of view looking into the region.
Fantastic.
As well.
That's great. Thank you for that. Great. Anyone wants to pick that up? What does it look like from the outside? What should this region be thinking about doing?
So I'll be honest to say I don't know as much about your region. I'm an East Midlandser, proud of that, but born and brought up in the East Midlands. And I, you know, just some observations. I mean, clearly we're talking about it from a city perspective. You're working at a much broader region, and in actual fact, we're quite interested to hear how you're working as a region, because we're in the process of negotiating a combined authority for that wider region. So there is something about scale. So we're working on a city-based area. We're working on a much tighter geographic footprint, and clearly there's a much broader, much wider area here and a bigger ambition, but also I would say greater potential. But inevitably, with a larger footprint, you're also working with perhaps different interests, perhaps not the same. So maybe there's something about, from our experiences, it was about having agreement about the outcomes. Does everyone agree about what the outcome is? What does good look like? Is there a collective vision and agreement around that, and how you get there? Doing that in a smaller area is perhaps easier, would be my reflection. I would say, certainly from our perspective, we've developed the plans that we have. It's close working with both the operators, so the transport network providers, the tram operators. You know, we own our bus company, so having alignment around your visions between what, as a local authority, we want to see happening, having strong public support and buy-in to that. So we have a strong commitment to engaging with our citizens about understanding what those needs are, and then using our leveraging power. So to your point earlier around how do you use your commissioning role, we have used our commissioning role and our role as a major shareholder of the bus company to ensure that our objectives align with their objectives, and we can then see that happening. So there is something about having commonality in terms of everyone agreeing around what you need. I would imagine probably you've got more diversity in terms of the spatial area. You've got a combination of rural and urban areas, understanding the different needs of those different places and recognizing how those come together. You're from the chamber, you know, we work quite closely with our respective chamber, understanding the needs of business and ensuring that you can meet those. So from our perspective, I've referenced to the tram earlier, quite controversial at the time in terms of introducing the workplace parking levy, but on the other hand, the tram network and the benefit that provided was the way in which we're able to bring businesses on board to recognize that, so for example, 20 out of our 30 largest employers have a tram stop within 800 metres of their locality. So it's understanding what everyone wants to achieve out of that common shared objective, and recognising that there may be differences in it, and seeing how you might seek alignment. So from someone who doesn't know your area very well, there's just some of the observations from someone looking in from the outside. Really, really helpful. John, do you want to?
Yes, I think the question from the Barnsley colleague is absolutely a brilliant question, and it goes to the heart really of where we go from here in terms of South Yorkshire. So I came here, and what I've experienced since, a real sense of a region that's lost its sense of what the future potential is, feels quite defeated, has low expectations of what's possible, and I think that's manifested in different ways. So it's very interesting. If you ask national government, if you ask the North, what South Yorkshire's, or you ask the East Midlands, what's South Yorkshire's priorities in terms of rail, national roads, they won't know. If they ask us in press, we probably come up with what I always think of as the Heinz 57 kind of everything, but of course everything is nothing really. And I think another manifestation of this is, you see it in some of the quite angry debates in Sheffield of recent weeks and months about choices in terms of air quality, in terms of road space reallocation. There really isn't a sense of it's possible for anything to be better. Change is worse. So in terms of the 2030 question, I think there's several elements to that. One is, in the short to medium term, getting a more mature debate about some of the difficult challenges in front of us at a more local authority level. That's a big win. If I hope in the next 5 years, if we ask regional, national government, what do you think South Yorkshire's priorities are, they will know. And that is a stepping stone to actually starting to deliver those priorities in the period up to 2030.
Fantastic. Yes, one here, and then I'll go to some from Slido.
High Speed UK. We've actually heard very little about rail so far. Thank you, Free and John, for mentioning it very slightly just now. But to develop, one of the South Yorkshire's greatest resources is its strategic rail network, not only what it is now, but really what it was, and by appropriate restoration of routes, how much it could be. But so much of what you can do in rail constrained by the fact that the decisions have already been taken. Very specifically, on HS2 and the integrated rail plan, we actually have a system. We have South Yorkshire getting virtually nothing out of the current proposals, no strategic vision for the area, and I can only really illustrate how bad the HS2 and the integrated rail plan are by actually asking this gathering for a short while to persuade you how much better it could be if actually we did plan it from the start as an integrated national network, which would then deliver the local benefits. So the question really is, do you have any perception of how badly you're doing currently from the integrated rail plan? And I'll put that particularly to Mr. Dowie, but maybe the other speakers also.
I'd love a question where the answer is in the question. Yes, very badly.
Can we speak to you, please?
So, well, no, absolutely, and we can speak afterwards. But I think, in an odd sort of way, the chaos that the HS2 aspiration has now descended to on the east side of the Pennines, and of course this is an East Midlands issue as much as a South Yorkshire issue. It's a West Yorkshire issue as much as a South Yorkshire issue. I think I wouldn't have wished us to be here, but now we're here. There is an opportunity for the east side of the Pennines, east side of the Midlands, to start asserting what do we want out of all of this debris. And I do think there is there's a critical opportunity here in terms of the core Midland Main Line up to Sheffield, through Rotherham, up through the Dearne Valley to Leeds as the backbone of Yorkshire and backbone of part of the East Midlands. And in a way, we need to stop letting government play around with high-speed rail and messing our brains and start asserting, actually, in terms of the classic network, there is a huge opportunity here, government. Stop planning and get on with delivering it.
Very good. Well, so there's probably a follow-up conversation to be had outside of the over coffee later. Thank you for the question. So there's a question on Slido about freight and deliveries and sort of intercity logistics. I wonder whether any of our guests want to comment on how they've gone about trying to manage and mitigate the impact of those vehicles, obviously many of which heavy vehicles have a heavy carbon footprint as well. So would you like to pick up that question?
Yes, so we've just brought in a clean air zone, which isn't designed to impact on freight. It's designed to deal with our pollution problem that we have in Bristol. But it does, as a side effect, cut down, we think, looks like from the figures, the number of HGVs coming into the city centre. Other than that, we've used really soft power, as I said, via the One City Transport Board, trying to get people together, talking about where people need their charging facilities, etc., etc. I would also commend to you the regional transport boards. So we have the STB down in Western Gateway, STB Peninsula down in Cornwall, and I think really get behind those who have a real role in things like freight and also new fuels and where those fueling will be, and trying to bring some alignment on that between the different authorities. So it's one of those kind of more rarefied things that people don't realise goes on is STBs, but actually they could be really, really important. And that was one of the things where the government is keen to get on with at the moment. So very important to work with those on that, I think.
It's really helpful. Anything to add on freight? Either of you?
I mean, I guess a couple of observations. It often is a bit of a black hole or a secondary consideration in transport. I mean, ironically, given Pete Dyson's presentation, we tend to think too much about people sometimes, and actually freight is important sinew of the economy. I'm very struck in conversations what is unique and actually quite impressive about South Yorkshire and transport. Well, one is tram train, the other is our significance in the UK rail freight sector. So I think it is something we need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, so there's a strength to tap into there around rail.
Yeah.
Some of the projects we're doing in other parts of the country, in Liverpool and elsewhere, is making much greater use of waterways and looking at green, even autonomous barges to take goods and vehicles off the road. We've got colleagues working on drones, which feels slightly further away, but there are vehicles on there. Yeah, Sajeeda.
Yeah, just an example that we've got. We're recently trialing e-cargo bikes.
Yes.
So that whole concept of that last mile delivery within urban areas, that is a challenge. Colleague referenced STB. Similarly, we work with Midlands Connect, which is our regional transport board, and that looking at freight and how you, particularly in urban areas, how you deal with that last mile element in terms of getting goods to where they need to be. I think there's always more to learn on that, and that's the trial that we're undertaking at the moment to see how that might support some of that, removing cargo in urban areas. We've also, like many areas, we've taken out some of our major urban roads within the city, pedestrianised to make it much harder to penetrate parts of the cities. So we allow priority access to bus and taxis, clearly active travel, but not necessarily heavy goods in the middle of the city.
Yeah. One of my favourite photos I took recently was of a cargo bike delivery person bringing, I think it must have been at least 10 kegs of beer to one of our local pubs near the office. And I thought, if there's an argument that cargo bikes can do anything, I mean, that's it, isn't it? It looks all right, but I was there for that moment. So I've got a few more on slides I'm going to come on to in a minute. But I'm going to pre-warn the speakers that I'm going to ask you perhaps for your best mistake. What have you learned? What's gone wrong that we could learn from and try and avoid through your journey overhauling your transport and connectivity? So I'll just give you forewarning of that question. So there's a question here about land use, and I think that kind of touches on an earlier point on Slido about the degree and sort of similar to the point that was made about the distributed nature of this region. You've got a couple of urban clusters, you've got a variety of established points of connection, you've got a variety of villages and towns in the area. And one of the powers that local authorities do have is around land use and around how we develop and how we structure and think about the long-term development and sort of economic geography of the region. To what extent are our three speakers, have you been working, as you say, on the land use development side to create more hubs where it is more possible to move around? And perhaps to John, where does that kind of economic development, economic geography planning fit into the plan? Sajeeda, do you want to?
So I don't think you can, land use and how you move has to be integrated. Doing one without the other is much harder. And as many urban authorities, we've had to learn how to do that effectively. And sometimes the two don't always come together in the same way. So from our perspective, and we're a very tightly bound city. So in a sense, our land use is constrained by our boundary. Yep. Administratively, we're much smaller than the Greater Nottingham area. So in a sense, we very dense, very urban. In a sense, that drives how we use our land in the most effective way, how transport enables that, unlocks that. But in reality, I think, quite frankly, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. The two have to integrate for places and places to be livable, to be integrated, to be successful. I think the two have to work in tandem, quite frankly.
Fantastic. Anything to add on that from the Bristol point of view? How do you have a more effective conversations with your neighbours? Obviously, you say in your areas that almost the challenge you have is that a bunch of stuff happens here, but a bunch of stuff happens outside of your control. Here in this conversation, we've got a different version of that. We've got everyone's in the room, but with a variety of different levers. So how have you had effective conversations at the regional level?
Well, in Bristol, I think only is one of our park and rides is actually in the city. So we've been trying to create a ring of park and rides for years, and the only possible one that can be in the city is there now. And we have one in North Somerset, and we want one in Baines, and we want one in South Gloucestershire. So if nothing else, that drives you to work together, even when you desperately don't want to, because we just can't get anything done, because Bristol is so much bigger than the footprint of Bristol City Council. So, you're leading horses to water in many ways, and they're not wanting to drink. But then we've done things in the past. We've got a Metrobus rapid transit, it's very good, it's very popular, but so many politicians have kind of got scars from it because it was done as a partnership between authorities. We didn't have a combined authority at the time, it was done as a partnership. And it was so lacking in transparency for the average person, or even the average politician. And we know the average person, is an expert on transport, but has very little idea really about how transport works. And most politicians, frankly, are like that. They don't know much about how transport works, but they have strong opinions. And so the Metrobus really, got everyone in a lather, and it was completed and is now very popular. And still a lot of politicians don't like it because they never quite understood the governance. There wasn't the governance that gave the transparency to be able to communicate it. So they were left stuck in the middle of an awkward discussion. So, governments, combined authorities, we have to make them work. So the alternative is too bad.
Very good. And we are increasingly seeing, say, pan-regional organisations. You've touched on Western Gateway, and we've got a variety of different groups, haven't we, which are promoting that. And I think we see that's very positive. And indeed, having the mayor here, I think it is clear that the mayoral combined authorities are one of the most interesting and energetic forms of governance, I think, and leadership we're seeing in the UK. So it's great to be here. There was a question over here. Microphone's coming to you from behind.
Hello and good morning. Brandon Jones from First Bus. There was a a mention earlier around mobility interchange hubs, and I'm particularly interested from our guests around their views on feeder services, first mile, last mile options. I think there are particular examples in this region where regular and frequent long journeys can be quite expensive to operate, and shorter feeder services might well provide a more suitable option to connect people onto frequent corridors. Is that an opportunity that you're exploring, and do you have any views on the future of that kind of provision? Thank you.
Anyone?
I'll start first. It's a tricky one, really, because it's pretty clear that passengers value direct journeys. So there is a real serious inconvenience, and some of this is visible in the mayor's postbag, of people who do not like having to change from bus onto tram or bus onto bus. And I'm sure it deters a particular segment of the population. On the other hand, for the reasons you're alluding to, it may actually be the more sort of cost-effective option. It's, at least on paper, integration. So I think it's a case-by-case struggle is probably the reality.
Yeah, but
yeah, so there's the infrastructure element of how you integrate different modes of transport, and on one level we've managed to do that quite successfully in terms of tram to bus to other forms of transport. But the other area where we are exploring is how you utilise technology to integrate journeys. So one of the things that we're looking at through the future, I always forget the different acronyms that government use, the FTZ, the Future Transforming Cities Type Fund, where we're looking at mobility as a service. So we're developing a platform where we integrate all of the different modes of transport, so it makes the journey easier and more integrated for the end user. So I think certainly looking to the future, thinking about the journey and the individual, how do you take away some of the barriers? And to John's point, people want ease, they want convenience, they want reliability, they want affordability. And those things are all, I don't think any one is more important than the other. It will differ for individuals, but one of the things we are looking at is how do you make it easier so that you know where you need to go and how you need to get there, and it's accessible in the way that you can utilise technology to make those informed choices.
Good. Right, I'm going to go to my favourite mistake question, and then there's one at the front, so perhaps microphone this way in a moment. Ruth, let's come back to you since you've been sitting patiently. What have you got a favourite mistake? What pitfalls should we avoid in embarking on this journey for South Yorkshire?
Yeah, I think personally for me, I was quite involved in the low emission zone implementation and design, and as you can imagine, with many of the decisions we'll all be making across the different projects that we're running, it had such a high profile political element to that, and that kind of making sure that we're involving our members in the sort of the process before it goes to committee, allowing that conversation, allowing the briefings, and allowing that level of understanding as to, with the low emission, so for example, we had quite a lot of technical briefings with members in advance of coming to the big day. And there were several big days actually of decision making along the stages of the low emission zone, and for us we didn't maybe quite get it right in the level of briefings that we had running up to a particularly sensitive decision that was needing to be made along the boundary, and we ended up getting slightly derailed for that. We really didn't have very long to pull it back. We had an implementation timeline which was fixed by Transport Scotland, Scottish Government, and all four cities, ourselves along with Aberdeen, Dundee and Glasgow, we're all running to that timescale, and we absolutely didn't be the ones to want to drop the ball on that. So we had to do some very, very quick turning around of information and stuff that was requested as a part of that decision that slightly derailed us. It was to do with ensuring that we were capturing carbon reduction as well as nitrous oxide reduction. So it was a bit of a technical debate, and we had to rush at getting an additional committee involved, set up, which wasn't an all that popular decision to make, but if we hadn't have done that, we would have been completely out of time. So I think from a reflection on that, it was just to make sure that when we've got these really difficult decisions, to be making sure that we're involving members and having that conversation early with the level of capacity building that's needed if necessary as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, can't overestimate the amount of time needed to build relationships, build momentum, understand motives, and that's a great insight. Councillor, a favourite mistake or pitfall that we should avoid in order to accelerate towards the success that you've had?
Yeah, well, yes. So at the moment we have a plan for a regional mass transit system, which is, of course, you know, we have some existing suburban rail, we have metro bus, etc., etc. What we're trying to do is to gradually bring greater levels of segregation, reliability, integration of ticketing, etc., etc., and some new construction of some underground, some overground, as yet undecided. Somebody used the word overground, somebody political, underground, used the word underground at some point. And of course the media absolutely jumped on this, and it has been impossible to get that word out and replace it with mass transit in order to explore the subject in any more depth. So we now have like plates with a picture of Bristol Underground looking exactly like TfL's model, etc., etc. And the learning is be careful before you open your mouth, how you name things. We have a very sizable LTN we are developing in Bristol, and it's called a livable neighbourhood. Anyone who calls it a low traffic neighbourhood, I will jump on them immediately, physically, verbally, I don't care. It's about the reimagining of street space, which goes along with what Ed was talking about earlier, new infrastructure. We also need to reimagine street space. It's not about getting rid of cars. There's many, many more objectives. And we haven't been troubled by Right Said Fred or anyone else yet, because they obviously haven't cottoned on to the fact that our livable neighbourhood is actually exactly like Oxford's ambitions for an LTN, because we've given it a different name. So, be careful what you call things, and call them something good at the beginning, I would say. Because even your politicians can be ripped apart by their different pressures on them if all you're arguing about really is what is the meaning of a word.
Yeah, very powerful, very powerful. Sajeeda?
There's a lesson to be learned there, really, isn't it? Be careful before you open your mouth.
In all
I
things.
haven't learned it.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you.
I might reflect on that actually before I speak. There's something about unintended consequences of a good idea. So, a speaker earlier was talking about behaviour change. So you may want to introduce something and assume that is going to work, but don't assume that people will behave in the way that you want to. The example I've got in my head is we tried to remove taxis from a certain area, and we created a lovely cycle lane. What happens now? It's much harder for the taxis to get to the place we want them to go to, so they park in the cycle lane. So we've got this lovely cycle lane, but you've got taxis pulled in there because we've tried to take them off one area and we moved them to a destination, which, you have to swing in and out, so it adds to journeys, and it's less convenient, but that's the intent. But so the lesson is, don't assume that people will use things in the way that you design them to. So you may have to rethink your design once it's implemented and think about how so there's nudge theory, but then there's equally sometimes you may have to step up the implementation because people won't use things in the way that you intend. So that's just that sort of constant learning, design and then implement and then review and then redesign and adjust. So best endeavours sometimes don't in implementation work in the way that you intend them to.
Yeah, that's really important, and it's, I think, doubly challenging in the built environment and the transport infrastructure space, because this is expensive, complicated, but there are organisations, ours and others, who, as you say, are out there to help iterate and develop. And we're actually delighted to be in Bristol now. We've partnered with Bristol Temple Meads Station, the Innovation District there, to create a rail innovation zone, which is as much about what happens on the tracks as what happens in the station and around the area, and thinking about connections and the technologies to help that be a really effective place of interchange. So, yeah, learning as you go I'm reminded we have a chap, again, another Bristol, sorry, he was involved in Bristol, Nick Sturge, who gave a talk to our Place Leadership Academy a couple of weeks ago. We had one speaker talk, who was from the Northeast, and he talked about making a plan, sort of economic development plans to us, and kind of sticking to it and driving it through, being very, it was very clear. And then we had Nick come and talk about the experience in Bristol, and basically his whole approach was just kind of surf the wave of chaos. You can't really predict, you can't, you will say something wrong, something will happen, and so the need for place leaders to have agility and creativity in how you manage what comes, because, and I guess the reality is somewhere between the two, you need a plan, you need some sense of where you're going and what your outputs and outcomes, the future you're trying to achieve is, but no plan ever survives contact with reality, does it? Anyway, so we've got another question here, which I suspect maybe a rail one. Oh, great.
It's going to be a bus one.
Excellent.
Quentin MacDonald, High Speed UK, railway engineer, with a bus question. Ruth is really the only person so far who's actually talked about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is called climate change. Now, all of these things are excellent, but they've got in the longer run to be focused on climate change. I was a City of York councillor. I live in York 50 years. City of York councillor for 12 years, executive member for 4. So I've been on the inside of local politics as well. Now, the point is, we have a city that has got lots of buses driving around it. One day I'd like to do a head count as to how many empty seats are being driven around and as a percentage. How do you get people out of their cars? Well, you could say it doesn't matter because we're going to make all the cars green anyway. Yeah, right. Hang on a tick. It's not as easy as that. I'd like to see something really radical. People vote with their wallets. Make the buses free. Discuss.
Very good. Very good. Well, I mean, a great provocation. I suppose the question is, yes. Well, I suppose what are your responses, and what are the sort of bold things? What's next? Maybe I can kind of take that question and kind of phrase it as what's next? What's the next bold step? We had the former deputy mayor of Vienna speak at a dinner last year, and over I think her 6 or 10 years she was in post. She moved to a position where you can buy a public transport pass for the whole of the Vienna city region for €1 a day, or 365 euros, and they did that through increasing revenue from parking and a variety of other mechanisms. But as you say, if you make things free or incredibly available, then one would hope they will be used. But I suppose that's one of those assumptions that we need to test. Yeah, great. Well, I suppose, Ruth, let's come to you first. I'm not going to ask you whether or not you're considering making buses free, although it would be amazing if you told us that. We got a preview, but perhaps I can ask you, what's the next bold thing that you're hoping to do to move things forward, particularly with an eye to climate action?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it is a debate we've been having in the city as well. I think the idea of having free bus travel absolutely would be such a huge step forward. It's just obviously the fund and the delivery of that, and how you would do that really in relation to supporting a viable system. And with Edinburgh, we've got quite a different system. We've got a publicly owned bus company. The tram company is part of our Transport for Edinburgh. So we do have quite a lot of levers to push in that sense of getting transformational change across our public transport network. And I think the big things we're concentrating on is integration of ticketing, making interchange as seamless as possible. I think you're absolutely right. That choice that you make when you're looking at a mobility as a service app. So we've been trialing one in East Lothian that we've been connecting into. And when you actually look, East Lothian's quite a bit more rural than Edinburgh. When you actually look at the choices you're able to make to get from one place to another, the taking the trip by car comes out as being the quickest, easiest journey in many instances. Although you're given options to get a taxi to the bus stop and then get a bus or whatever it may be, I think nobody's in the right mind is probably likely to do that if they have a car, and I think we're all probably guilty of that. So I think from an Edinburgh perspective, we've got a really good bus network system already, so we've got an advantage in that sense, and it's about connecting up the places that aren't already as accessible as they should be, using mobility hubs as places where you can collect together elements of sustainable transport to then head you off onto the bus. But that message around actively moving to bus stops, walking, cycling and things, that the health benefits of that. I think it is, you know, a lot of it is down to affordability and convenience, but I think that climate change message is really hitting home, and across our citizens we are seeing quite a lot of seismic changes of people making choices that are sort of, you know, socially responsible rather than just the cheapest or quickest way to get places. And there is the demand management element, I suppose, as well, where you develop those restrictions and support people getting on buses, so it would be potentially cheaper. We've got our low emission zone, which is, you know, acting a little bit like that, but we're also exploring the congestion charge in Edinburgh and across the other 4 big cities as well. So I think there's many different ways. I mean, in an ideal world, absolutely free bus travel. I'm not convinced it would happen. So yeah, it'd be good to hear from the other panelists to see what they think as well.
Great stuff. Thank you. Yeah, well, yeah. Sajeeda, what's next and ambitious in Nottingham?
So I'd agree with many of the comments that have already been made, and just from the carbon neutrality, climate change perspective, I should have said that as a city, we probably have the boldest ambition to reach carbon neutral by 2028. I think that's the first within the UK, and we've got extensive plans around how we decarbonise all aspects, and clearly transport is a big element of that. So in that space, one of the big areas we've been focusing on is how we electrify our fleet. So our own fleet, we've invested significantly in terms of EV infrastructure to enable that, extensive network expansion around active travel to make that as a choice. Integration, we've talked about using technology as an enabler. We've successfully secured some Zebra funding to electrify 78 buses. So, you know, quite massive, radical investment in electrifying major public transport. Clearly, the tram network helps. It's electric. It's a bit of a double-edged sword at the moment with the cost of electricity being a key barrier. But in terms of the fleet, in terms of sustainable transport network, integration, reliability, affordability. So the point, I think, you know, it would be great if we could get to an aspiration where public transport was subsidised to a greater level than it currently is. The funding from the national bus funding and recovery funding has enabled that, the £2 journeys that many of us have rolled out. I think reliable, sustainable, long-term funding solutions. The piecemeal short-termism makes that much harder, makes it much harder to plan. So, you know, we're not part of a combined authority yet. We're developing a combined authority, and I think areas that have that ability to be able to have that long-term funding, long-term plan, and provide sustainable sources on a more subsidised basis would enable that. And I think for us, it's just probably, I guess, it's incremental building on where we are, but thinking to the future around how we use some of those innovations and looking at the trials that have been run in other places, using technology to advance that and continue that journey.
Fantastic. And Councillor, what's next for Bristol?
Well, I mean, I've heard, yes, stories of places in Europe who've got free public transport. I forget, is it Estonia or wherever? But I think Sheffield did under David Blunkett. I think they had free buses, didn't they? About 40 years ago, the bendy buses, or it was 2p or something like that. So what's changed in the last 40 years? And what has changed is central government has taken absolute control by one method or another over what cities and regions are allowed to do. And now we are chained to their mediocrity, or worse than mediocrity. So, you know, for supposed fear of making a mistake, you know, you actually can't do anything like that, even though you can toss up the figures and see it would likely be successful. So for me, devolution of power, real power, and the power to raise taxes locally, the power to take up the model that you want locally, is incredibly important to transport and to everything. And of course there will be some failures, but if this is what success looks like, then, you know, we can do better, I think.
Very good, very good. Right, so I've got one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to ask one final one, and then we'll wrap. So over to you.
Thank you. Gareth Morgan from the Ultimate Battery Company.
Oh, we can't hear you just yet, so wait for the, that's all right. I think, yep, try again.
Sorry, Gareth Morgan from the Ultimate Battery Company. It is a really left field question. It's probably aimed more at Edinburgh than anywhere else. How do you engage with the visitors to your city into your plans? Because South Yorkshire has got quite a big tourist attraction pot that we sometimes forget about. We need to get our visitors to use our networks and to understand our congestion zones, etc.
Amazing, great question. Ruth, how are you engaging with your visitors, with your tourists to help them engage with your mobility options?
Yeah, it is quite challenging, I suppose, because I hope you can hear me.
You can.
Yeah, we've got a group in Edinburgh called ETAG, the Tourist Association Great Representative Group, which we link in with a heck of a lot on all of our big plans across the city, and so they're really a helpful body for us to be able to tap into that sector. I suppose also we've got our economic development plan that considers the impacts on tourism and all sorts of other things as well, that we work very closely with our economic development colleagues on that aspect. But we're just about to embark on quite a significant combined engagement process along our action plans, so looking at road safety, parking, public transport, active travel and air quality, all in one big combined consultation at the start of just after Easter. So what we're doing there is looking at the different varieties of ways we can capture all sorts of different visitors, people who work in Edinburgh, people who live in Edinburgh, through different methods like focus groups, for example. So we're tapping into our networks and trying to explore how we best do that. We've also been having quite a lot of engagement with the tour bus and coach sector. So we've got a strategy at the moment that we're looking at with them to make it easier for groups of tourists to come into the city in a sustainable way as possible, low carbon transfer into the city, and how we can work with that sector to support tourism, and I suppose in a sort of roundabout way, gaining the views through them as well. So it's yeah, I think it is a challenge though, because it's far and wide. In a city like Edinburgh, you've got people coming from all over the globe, so making sure that we're really fundamentally, I think it comes down to making sure we're as an accessible, inclusive and welcoming city, and put ourselves in the position of a visitor who is coming to see the sites and travel around in a convenient and easy way, and that's the same for a resident or somebody coming into work. So in a way, it's not that probably that different, the needs. It's just making sure that we're catering for that sector as best we can.
Amazing, really good, thank you. So I think we've heard about the importance of understanding your partners in a place, representing both the corporate citizens, the public, the employers, and others, and understanding the motives, recognizing that everyone comes in with a different set of needs and opportunities and desires, and designing coming together around a shared vision, a plan that's grounded in that understanding and understanding what we're looking for. We've talked a bit about smarter spending and using the commissioning power and the land use power that the public sector, the local authority in particular, has. We talked about learning from others and trying to introduce innovations, trying to avoid the kind of everyone inventing the wheel over and over again, and that's been great. It's been really great to be able to draw from this expertise. I've seen that in the comments as well. And having that kind of long-term vision, recognizing that it takes time to affect change. So I think, once again, I really commend all of you in South Yorkshire who are here embarking on this journey. I think this is a really important and valuable piece of work, and we've had some really great food for thought in this session. Final question from me. We've had you up on the panel and on the screen as our pioneers, learning from you, a couple of steps ahead of South Yorkshire on the journey. Who do you look to? Where do you look around the world for inspiration in terms of what you see as pioneering place leadership as it relates to transport and mobility connectivity? Sajeeda, do you want to?
So a lot of people talk about the continent, people talk about Netherlands, talk about Stockholm, and there's lessons to be learned from everywhere. But I guess, not quite answering your question, but it's local circumstances. So yes, you can look to other places to take things that work in certain places, but that context has to be relevant. So context, circumstances, environment, and it's applying what works in your locality. So just because something works in one place, yes, you can learn, and there's always learnings to be had from everywhere, but you've got to root it in place. You've got to root it into what works for your locality. And I think being open to learning is the key, and wherever that's from, but relevant to your locality.
Very good, very good. Councillor, any favourites?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. You can bring nuggets in from everywhere. We've got a park and ride that we're transforming, we hope, into a transport hub and interchange. So a new station is being built. We've got buses, obviously. We want to put in e-scooters, e-bikes for hire. But one thing I said to transport officers, how about a coffee bar? I said, wherever you go in the world, these interchanges are social places. People go to eat, and it makes the journey more acceptable. We're talking about having feeder buses into there. It's a lot better if you can say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll have my breakfast at the interchange before I move on to the next stage. Because you're talking to a transport officer, so the transport officer's sort of eyes glaze open. You talk to the licensing and the concessions person about a coffee bar and a falafel place or something like that out there. Okay, we'll go and do that. And you can make money out of it, eyes begin to light up, you know. But the main thing is it drives patronage because it's what people want to have. You know, so that's my experience of traveling a lot. You go to Turkey, you'll go somewhere else, you'll see people live in their days in a transport interchange because you can buy, you can sell do a lot of your business at transport interchange.
Yeah, places become destinations rather than just a node on a journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point. Ruth, coming back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with the panelist actually. I think it's very place specific, but from our experience, some recent stuff that we've been doing around road space reallocation, we have been looking across the continent and further afield on examples of what things have worked really well. So we've been looking at Ghent in Belgium around their circulation plan. We've been looking at Auckland as well. They've got a similar sort of arrangement. So we've been trying to take the best bits of those different things, combining together on what might work for Edinburgh, but obviously with a bespoke answer to that, taking in the sort of learnings. We've also been looking at Vienna as well around the women's safety narrative, which is absolutely coming through a lot of the threads of our policy making and delivery. The George Street transformation I was talking about on my slides, that's had a really significant element of that has been informed by women's safety audit work and things. So, and Vienna are really trailblazing on that in terms of their planning. So we have been looking to them. But one thing I would say is, I know maybe people are familiar with the Glasgow-Edinburgh dynamic. We were often being seen in the, media and different narratives around competing with each other and, trying to be the first one to do this and the first one to do that. But actually the reality is, and I think this is a learning that could be shared across us all, is we do a heck of a lot of work with Glasgow in partnership. We kind of tell each other about the mistakes and, we're learning about the different synergies that we can bring in terms of our conversation at a national level, how we can support each other to really drive forward change that's helpful to cities of our sort of size and complexity. But in that sense, that partnership working, there's a real sense of mutual, benefits there and support across those kind of conversations. So I think from my perspective, it's trying to establish and strengthen some of those partnerships with other local authorities that you see synergies with and, can work together a little bit more. We perhaps don't do enough of that. So I think that would be a good thing.
Very good. Well, today has been a good example of where we have sought to do that. So look, thank you all for your questions and enthusiastic engagement. I'm looking forward to continue the conversation with you in the workshops shortly. Please join me in thanking our expert panelists. And I'm very, very pleased you're to hand over from one Sam to another. You've got two Sams for the price of one today, and we're heading to the next session with Dr. Sam Chapman. So over to you.